Welcome to Advocacy Toolkit number 4, How a Bill Becomes a Law. In this toolkit, we are going to cover the legislative process pertaining to both the federal government and state governments. Many of you might recognize this image from the old Saturday morning cartoon Schoolhouse Rock. Surprisingly, the cartoon does a good job of actually providing a simple overview of the legislative process. Unfortunately, in reality, the process is rarely straightforward. First off, any piece of legislation must be introduced by a sponsor. A sponsor is a member of the legislature. Once a bill is introduced, it is then quickly referred to a committee of jurisdiction. It must then pass out of committee and then be voted on by the full legislative chamber, such as the House of Representatives or the Senate. Finally, the bill itself only becomes law when it is signed by the executive branch, such as the president or a governor. While the basics of this process are simple enough to be explained by a children's cartoon, the devil is in the details. Sticking with the childhood metaphor, passing legislation is more like a game of chutes and ladders. A bill can proceed as scheduled and then quickly move back to the beginning of the process. In addition, a bill can get to the very end of the process and then be abruptly stopped. Before going into more depth, please note that the state and federal legislative process is quite similar. However, there are important differences between the two. We will cover a few of these, but make sure to also check out Toolkit number 6, State versus Federal Government. So first up, let's cover what a legislative session is. A legislative session is a discrete time period in which bills can be introduced and passed. In Congress, this is a 2-year term following each election. You may have heard this term referred to as the 114th Congress or 115th Congress. What this means is that this is the 115th 2-year legislative session. The first was in 1780 when the Constitution was first adopted. State legislative sessions vary widely. Some can be as short as 1 or 2 months a year, while others only occur every other year. If you want to find out more information about your specific state session, visit the website on this slide. Finally, the most important aspect of a legislative session is that all legislative activity must occur within that session. Once a new session starts, the entire legislative process starts over again. So here we are at the first step of the process, which is introducing a bill. As mentioned on an earlier slide, all legislation must be sponsored or authored by a legislator. In Congress, a bill can be introduced anytime the legislature is in session. However, state governments often have filing deadlines that must be met in order for legislation to be considered. All bills are assigned a number/letter combination corresponding to when and where they were introduced. For example, you may recognize terminology such as H.R. 50 or SB 100. The letters denote which chamber the bill was introduced in, such as the House or the Senate. This is important because there is often 2 versions of a bill, one in the House and another in the Senate. Finally, except in rare instances, all new bills are immediately sent to a committee of jurisdiction once they have been introduced. Luckily, Congress in every state has a website where you can easily track the status of new bills. This is a screenshot from congress.gov regarding H.R. 6, which is the 21st Century Cures Act. On pages like this, you can find information about the sponsor, the committee information, if there have been any votes on it, and ultimately where the bill is on its path to becoming law. So once a bill is introduced, it is then referred to committee. Committees are really where the rubber meets the road and legislative process. They have the extensive power and jurisdiction over certain types of legislation. For example, there are committees with jurisdiction over healthcare or a committee to look at just tax bills. The committee process is also where legislators collect evidence and testimony in support of new bills. This is when hearings are held and patients and experts are asked to testify in support or opposition. Once all the hearings have taken place, a bill must be voted out of committee to move forward in the legislative process. This image is an example of a committee hearing. You may recognize it as they typically all look the same. There's a panel of witnesses answering questions from legislators. Given the importance of committees, most bills don't make it past this point. This is often because of a lack of public support or support from other legislators. Even with a lot of support, a bill can die because of strong opposition and lobbying from other groups. However, bills can also fail to leave committee simply because of time constraints. Committees consider hundreds of bills at any given time, and they can only get to so many of them before the session ends. Sometimes not enough time can just be an excuse, but more often than not, there's some truth to it. So once a bill has successfully passed out of committee, the next step is it must be considered by the full legislative chamber, such as the full House of Representatives or the Senate. However, there's no requirement that a bill be voted on at all. So even if it has made it out of committee, and even though there may be hundreds of legislators and patient groups supporting it, there's no requirement that it gets voted on. Because of this, the legislative leadership, such as the Speaker of the House or Majority Leader, have immense power over which bills get voted on and can move forward. And finally, in Congress, more bills tend to get votes in the House than in the Senate. This is because the Senate has very weird and arcane rules that prevent quick action on legislation. In effect, they designed it to be slow on purpose. This means there can be dozens of bills that have passed the House that will never pass the Senate and never become law. This screenshot is an example of a televised vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. This coverage can give you a quick sense of how many voted in favor of a bill or against it, and from which party. However, you'll need to go back to the bill website to find out exactly how your legislator voted. As mentioned before, in order for any piece of legislation to become law, both chambers of the legislature have to vote in favor of it. Even if a bill passes one chamber, it has to repeat the entire process in another one. It may even have to be reintroduced if there was only one version to begin with. So, assuming you've successfully pushed a piece of legislation through committee and through a full floor vote in both chambers, that still doesn't mean it has become law. In order to become a law, the bill has to be signed into effect by the executive, such as the president or the governor of a state. The executive can veto a bill and prevent it from becoming law even after all that work has taken place. A veto can be overturned, but only with overwhelming support from the legislature. Finally, most newly placed laws take effect in January of the year following their passage. However, there are several exceptions to this. For example, in the case of emergencies such as a hurricane or earthquake in a state or town that needs immediate assistance from the government, bills usually make provisions that allow it to be enacted immediately. In addition, sometimes the government doesn't want laws to go into effect quickly, so they may include provisions that delay how they will be implemented. For example, the Obamacare law was passed in 2010 but won't be fully implemented until 2020 or later. Believe it or not, there are still more chutes and ladders to this process that we didn't cover. Most notably, more than one committee can have jurisdiction over a bill. Within state governments, there is often a committee that focuses only on how much a proposed bill will cost, and no legislation can move forward until this committee approves it. If all this is making your head spin, don't worry. Rare Action is here to help. Our team is available to help you with every step of the legislative process. As a first step, I encourage you to look at other toolkits related to this one, such as Toolkit number 6 and Toolkit number 3. Also, make sure to check out the Rare Action State Legislative Tracker and the State Report Card. Thank you so much for your time doing this toolkit. As always, check out more on rareaction.org and rarediseases.org.